I'm Paige. I'm the community lead at the NatureTech Collective, and each week we bring together experts who are harnessing technology to protect and regenerate our natural world. Last month, we explored what NatureTech is and why it's critical for transitioning to a nature-positive economy. Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of its fundamental pillars, ground truth technologies. So these solutions are becoming increasingly vital as organizations face mounting pressures to understand and account for their impacts on nature. How can a company effectively manage its environmental risks if it can't measure what's happening on the ground? How can investors verify that their nature-based investments are delivering real impact? This is where ground truthing technologies come in. These tools and devices provide the evidence of what's actually happening in nature. So with the appearance of regulations and frameworks like TNFD that push companies to disclose their nature-related risks and impacts, having reliable, verifiable data isn't just nice to have, it's becoming a business imperative. Ground truth technology provide that crucial layer of direct observation that builds confidence in environmental monitoring and reporting, helping us also avoid the scandals that plagued the carbon markets. They turn abstract satellite data into verified reality and transform general assumptions about ecosystem health into measurable, actionable insights. So today we're privileged to have with us Carly Batist, an independent consultant and ground truth technology expert who's got extensive experience deploying these solutions across various ecosystems. Carly is going to walk us through the fascinating evolution of these technologies, and we'll explore how these tools are transforming our ability to monitor and protect biodiversity and what this means for conservation and regeneration efforts worldwide. So Carly, thank you for joining us. Can you start by telling us a bit about who you are and your journey into the world of ground truth technologies?
Yeah, great to see lots of familiar faces here. I'm Carly Batist. I'm currently kind of consulting for a number of different nature tech organizations. But how I actually got started in this was during my PhD when I was studying lemurs in Madagascar. And I was studying a particularly vocal species called the black and white ruffed lemur. And that proved to be very beneficial for using passive acoustic monitoring to monitor this species across a corridor, a landscape corridor, where we weren't sure of their distribution. So that was where I first got my my kind of first experience with acoustic monitoring, and then was kind of introduced to this broader field of conservation tech and nature technology. So it's been really exciting to see how even just in the past decade, the technology and the hardware and software has really just exploded. And it's an exciting time to kind of be at the forefront of this with all of that innovation. So usually it was people going out and seeing just themselves with binoculars and, Write in the Rain notebooks, and observing what they saw. In my case, it was these little fluffy guys. So this was kind of what was done for centuries within kind of ecology and fieldwork and trying to understand the animals and ecosystems around us. But the technology that now enables us to do this a lot more efficient actually has quite historical origins. So the first kind of bioacoustic recorders were used out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and required an entire wagon to drag them around. So this was in the 1930s. Things got a bit more kind of miniaturized in the 50s, and we had actually somewhat handheld recorders. But this is, now going on 100 years ago that these first recordings, bioacoustic recordings, were taking place. Camera traps have a similarly long history. The first camera trap images were actually taken in like the early 1900s by George Shiras. So he had a system that had a tripwire where if something hit it, it would trigger a flash on like 35 millimeter film. So these were kind of the first camera trap images that we had. And fast forwarding all the way to kind of present day, now things are a lot cheaper, a lot smaller, a lot more power efficient, and we see a ton of different kind of models for bioacoustic recorders, drones, camera traps. And within that, it's also kind of important to recognize that a lot of these innovations didn't come from kind of ecology themselves. They came from other spaces that were then adopted. So trail cams largely were used initially by hunters who were trying to find where deer or elk were coming, and then they've kind of been like co-opted for conservation as well. Acoustic recorders, a lot of that technology came from like the film and media industry, and then those microphones and stuff were then taken and used for this use case. Drones started really with military applications, and now are being used in conservation. So it's kind of interesting that the kind of conservation tech field is actually a lot of pulling technologies from other sectors and co-opting them for use in conservation. It's been kind of an interesting timeline to see how all of these technologies have developed. And now we have, a huge wealth of technologies at our disposal in our conservation technologist toolbox, ranging from satellites, which will be talked about a bit more in the next NTC Now session. UAVs or drones that are kind of airborne, or drones can also be on the ground or in the water, like gliders. We have on-ground sensors like camera traps, sound recorders. We can use environmental DNA to detect genetic traces of animals and plants and anything that has DNA for us to detect. There are GPS collars and tracking devices that we put on animals specifically to track. But within this, it's also important to recognize that like technology doesn't replace everything, right? So even within the context of the more traditional like scientist going out into the field, right now even that kind of method has um, a lot more tools at their disposal. Citizen science is becoming huge. There are phone apps that you can now use LiDAR on your phone and sample, just using your phone. So there is also kind of technological innovation within just having like scientists now going out into the field, in addition to these remote sensors that are meant to kind of um, replicate having people out in the field and replicating their eyes and ears. It's kind of, I mean, it's a bit in the middle, right? But drones are one way to combine a lot of these kind of on-ground sensors, because you can add, cameras, bioacoustic recorders, even DNA sampling arms to a drone's payload, which is a lot of what the work that was done with the Rainforest X Prize. A lot of the teams, all the kind of finalist teams, were using drones to carry these sensors into the forest and set up these labs that were kind of like deployed by drones. So I think it's a cool way to kind of integrate a lot of these different sensors together and realize that they don't necessarily have to be strictly on the ground. These sensors can also be attached to drones or gliders in the water to kind of collect all of this data. The difference between kind of the hardware and software and the sort of limit where the bottleneck was happening within this pipeline has shifted now because of the evolution of these hardwares and sensors. They're a lot smaller, they're a lot cheaper, and so the bottleneck really used to be just getting the actual sensor. And now that's shifted. It's quite, easy and cheap to get a lot of sensors. Um, some more, the cost obviously is different, a bit different across those different sensors. But now the bottleneck has really come to the data analysis phase and how we interpret all of this data, which AI is obviously helping a lot with, and that'll be talked about again in another NTC now. But it's an interesting transition that it tended to be kind of like hardware was the limiting factor, and because of that, you only focused on like one thing. So you had camera traps, or you had recorders, or it was kind of one technology, whereas now we're realizing the importance and the effectiveness of using different sensors in combination in a project specific way. So not every project is going to require every single technology, right? You want to really get away with the least amount that you need to deploy for the questions that you have and the information that you need to get. So just to kind of go through a little bit of, in a little bit more detail, some of these: environmental DNA, really great way of sampling the whole kind of tree of life by soil or water or even now air samples, where we're taking samples from the environment, extracting DNA, amplifying it, putting it through bioinformatic processes and metabarcoding protocols to basically match up the DNA bits that you find in the sample with reference DNA reference libraries of species that we already know, to match up and say, like, this is a beaver and this is a moose and this is this insect. So the real benefit is that you can go across the tree of life, right? Fungi, plants, invertebrates, a lot of species that are not well captured in other types of with other types of technologies. So this can be really, really helpful, but it is not necessarily place-based, right? So you don't know whether that animal actually was where that sample was taking place, or if it was, upstream and the DNA was carried down by water. You don't know if it was there yesterday or 2 weeks ago, right? There's not really a way to get at like individual identification. So really good for kind of broad biodiversity baselines, but if you need a bit more nuance, it might not be the best option. Acoustics, as I mentioned, are very good for vocal species, obviously, like the ruffed lemurs. I promised that there would be animal calls, so as promised. I hope that's playing.
Yes, it is.
Great.
Beautiful.
So they sound like little demons.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so for vocal species, really good, because each species and even individuals can have their own acoustic signature. So we can actually get below the species level as well. But not every species is vocal. Some species that aren't as vocal might be better suited to be captured on camera traps, which are good for, small to large mammals or ground dwelling birds. You can obviously put camera traps arboreally in trees as well, like this one up here that's showing this putty-nosed monkey. But a lot of what camera traps are really good for is a species like hoofed animals, big cats or predators, large mammals, small mammals like voles, and any small kind of critter. So this is kind of another way of capturing a different subset of animals with bioacoustics and camera traps, you have, right, like a timestamp, location stamp. It's a bit more kind of auditable, and because you have this archive of data. So that's one of the pros. Another pro with camera trapping, especially, you can estimate densities. You can do individual ID, particularly for marked animals that have stripes or spots. And this can happen underwater as well, right? With doing like analysis of fins for marine mammals, or spots like whale sharks. So that's kind of one of the benefits of using things like camera traps, is that ability to estimate density and abundance. Again, just to realize the breadth of animals that make noise. This is, if you want to think to yourself, give a guess.
Honestly, it's a bat. No.
So that is the aptly named musician wren, which sounds very melodic. And these microphones can also be put under the water. Well, hydrophones can be used underwater as well to get at things like this. So that is a beluga whale.
Oh.
So there's a really wide variety of animals that we can understand acoustically, including ones that we can't hear ourselves, like bats, which call in the ultrasonic, but we have ultrasonic recorders that can hear them. As I mentioned, drones can themselves be kind of a conduit to integrating sensors together. You can put LiDAR, thermal cameras, acoustics, acoustic recorders. You can have swabs, arms that come from the drone that swab for, for eDNA samples. And this was a lot of the work that was done, as I mentioned, with the Rainforest X Prize. So these are some of the prototypes that they were using there. And I really like this kind of as a kind of comprehensive overview of all of the different technologies and kind of what they're being used for. Something I haven't mentioned a lot as well is just environmental sensors, right? Weather stations, pH monitors, soil probes. All of that is kind of an additional suite of technologies that we can use to understand the ecosystem condition around us. So we're really spoiled for choice around using all of these technologies, and it's really now becoming a case of what are the specific technologies that are going to be the most effective for a particular use case, right? So it's kind of getting down to what specific data do you need, and what is the easiest way or the easiest sensor that is going to give you that data for that use case. There's a lot of companies, nonprofits, many who are in the naturetech collective who are now working on this kind of integration of on-ground technologies. So Ocala has used eDNA, camera traps, acoustic monitors. Particularly, they've got a really well-sampled site in Gabon. Wildmon is doing a lot of integrating those three eDNA, camera trapping, acoustics. Biometrio is also kind of bringing in satellite imagery with these on-ground imageries, or with these on-ground technologies, to get comprehensive insights. Hula.Earth makes their own sensor called the BioT sensor, which is kind of has microclimate sensors, acoustic recorders, lots of different sensors that they can put on there. Pivotal is also doing work kind of combining these technologies to really get a comprehensive picture in monitoring the effects of good things like a new protected area or restoration efforts, tracking restoration progress, as well as understanding the detrimental effects of, development or a new mine that was put in or things like that. And all of these use cases now have this broader lens within the regulatory landscape as the corporate sector and governments are increasingly trying to comply with multilateral environmental agreements like the Global Biodiversity Framework, voluntary corporate reporting like TNFD, all the way up to, regulation, actual policy like the EU restoration law, the EUDR when it comes into effect, deforestation regulation. So all of these kind of ground technology use cases are now being used through that kind of lens of corporate and governmental reporting and monitoring. And to just kind of segue into a bit of integrating on-ground technologies with remote sensing technologies, obviously one can't tell you everything. Remote sensing can only, really tell you what's coming from an aerial view that might be missing nuance. There's a phenomenon called the empty forest syndrome where, from the satellite image, it looks fine, but on the ground, there's actually really low species diversity. So you want to have, but obviously, ground technologies have a scale problem in that it takes a lot to deploy, hundreds of devices around and continue to replace batteries, SD cards, maintain them, things like that. So by using these technologies that operate at different scales and using them together, we kind of help to bridge that scale gap. And so a really great example of this that I love is the Project Centinela initiative from Planet, where folks that are doing on-ground sampling like Naturemetrics with eDNA, like Wildmon with camera traps and acoustic monitoring, are now have access to Planet's raw satellite imagery and derived products to integrate ground technology and the data that comes from those sensors with satellite imagery as well. So yeah, another NTC Now session will go more into kind of the geospatial, but I wanted to emphasize that really it's good to use them in conjunction, and there's a big push for those types of projects now moving forward. Like the example from Wildmon's project that I mentioned with Planet Indonesia. And it was kind of a case of they're trying to, the local Dayak communities on the ground that Planet Indonesia has built relationships with over the years. They are trying to establish no-take zones for bushmeat or hunting. And because of that, they had particular species that they were interested in that were kind of targets for the no-take zone. That a lot of it was, like they wanted to understand peccaries, pangolins, things like that tend to come up in either illegal trade or hunting. So they wanted to assess these particular species. So there was like a targeted kind of indicator species list, where camera traps would be good for, those mammal species. But they also wanted to understand, the conservation status of other species, particularly endangered birds in the area, like hornbills. So that was kind of okay, well, let's use acoustics for that then, right? And bring in satellite imagery to kind of map what the habitat is looking like and how different environmental layers or geospatial layers, like forest cover, or vegetation indices are matching up with the detections of these particular species that are being targeted for this project to monitor. What is the end goal of this project? Is it to, in this case, create no-take zones? Is it to monitor restoration? Is it to assess a regenerative agriculture practice, or the effect of developing a new building here? And are there particular species that you're interested in, or do you kind of want an overall biodiversity baseline? Um, so what's the project goal? What's the spatial scale of it, right? Is it just, this 100 hectares? Is it a landscape scale? And how is that going to influence sampling design, to try to, keep costs down? Obviously, I've said that these technologies are getting a lot cheaper, but it is still an upfront cost. And particularly for eDNA, the bioinformatic and analysis pipeline can still be quite costly. So you want to think about the spatial scale and what's going to work at the spatial scale that you're operating on. And then also think about the temporal scale. So is it going to be, sampling this site once every season for X amount of years? Is it going to be just a one-time kind of uh, a one-off project? What is the temporal ideal sampling schedule look like? And again, what technologies are going to best fit that? So it's very tempting, right, to just see all of these shiny things and be like, I want to use everything. But again, it's really, you want to make sure that you're using the most effective technologies and sensors for the use case or project that you're interested in, that will get you the answers that you need for that project,
Hmm.
given its goals, its temporal and spatial scale. So as I mentioned, like the bottleneck really has shifted from the data collection to the data analysis phase, because it's so much easier to access and deploy a lot of these different sensors. But their ability to run for really long extended periods of time, which is again a product of really efficient batteries and the innovation in battery life. We're now have a ton of data, terabytes of data that we have to figure out how to analyze and interpret and make sense of. So the bottleneck has really shifted into that analytical space in figuring out how we process all of this information. So that's where a lot of work with AI has come to, pick species out of camera trap images, to identify species based on their vocalizations, as well as I mentioned going below the species level and identifying individuals, which can help with assessing, density and abundance estimates. Um, so that can be done, particularly for marked animals. WildMe is a really great platform that's involved in individual identification from imagery. But we're also finding that acoustically, a lot of species have individual identification, have calls that can be identified to the individual. So that is AI is really helping and automate a lot of those processes, but you really want to keep a human in the loop. You need fundamentally people who know how to identify species and calls and things to be able to like train the models and then also evaluate them. For eDNA, the bioinformatics pipelines are getting a lot more cheap, a lot more quicker to run. Meta barcoding has come a long way. But there, the kind of big bottleneck is actually the availability of reference libraries, and reference genomes for to compare samples to. So when you have DNA in this, soil or water or air sample, and you're trying to compare it, sometimes we don't have, to the species level of everything in the world, of the entire tree of life. So sometimes we might only be able to get to, the genus or the family level, particularly when we get to things like invertebrates or fungi that are a lot less well understood and less sampled. So there are still, right, clear challenges to this. With the use of AI, a lot of, as you mentioned, there's a big push now to be implementing no-code solutions, interfaces that anyone can use. So for camera traps, Wildlife Insights is a big one. For acoustics, there's Arbimon, and increasingly now wrappers for the BirdNet model. There's Merlin, which is an app on your phone to detect bird species from their calls. So there's a lot more kind of accessible software and interfaces that are being implemented so that you don't need to have a programming background to be able to understand the world around you. And I think that's a really powerful movement in kind of empowering citizen science, local communities, folks across the world to connect more with nature and understand nature around them in their own lives, as well as in these more applied niche kind of use cases that we're used to in the nature tech space. It's really important to be integrating traditional ecological knowledge with these technological advances. And I think something that can help bridge the gap is, as I mentioned, right, there's still a lot of important context that you get from having someone actually go out and observe the world, or the ecosystem around them. But there's now a lot more tools to kind of make that information known, right? So rather than, dictating something in a voice memo or writing it down, there's, apps that can quantify that, where they can record different observations. This is used a lot in like protected area management tools like Smart and Earth Ranger, where there are apps that rangers have that they go out and they can observe everything. You can have it in pictographs so that there's not even like language, there's not like kind of text or anything to overcome language or technical barriers. And all of that then gets fed into kind of a central database that is informing like the management of that protected area. So I think there's now a lot of tools that we can also use when those indigenous peoples and local communities are going out and monitoring their own lands, to help kind of to provide a way of sharing the data that and the information that they're collecting in a way that's kind of more easily shared with other stakeholders within a project, if that makes sense. Insects definitely have been, I mean, and this is not just technologically, right? Like in the broader ecology field, invertebrates often are understudied and undersampled, and really what this trend that we're seeing is a microcosm of the larger ecology field that focuses on, like birds and mammals. So I think that kind of historical bias already is inherently already leading to a bias in the development of technologies to study insects and invertebrates. There's really good work going on to develop autonomous insect camera traps. There's actually a community in Wild Labs that is dedicated to this that Tom August leads. So I can pop the link for that. But there's a lot of good conversations going on there. Tom also, he's out of in the UK at the UK CEH, Center for Ecology and Hydrology. They've developed an Amy trap, that is kind of a system where there's like a light source that's attracting insects in, and then they have a camera and they're running that's like segmenting the different insects, and then they have AI models that are identifying the species and doing auto calculations and things like that. So it's definitely a something that's being worked on now, and being there's people that are directly trying to bridge that gap. But I think it is kind of just a product of the inherent bias that we already had in not knowing, you still need people to say like, oh, this is this type of moth and this is this type of, beetle. And there's not a whole lot of entomologists in the world who can do that. So I think it's a bit of a product of the existing bias in the kind of ecological field, but being worked on by a bunch of good folks now.